The new Tomb Raider games occupy a befuddling gray area on my critical spectrum. They have stellar presentation, are mechanically tight, offer plenty of thrills, and just bleed adventure. They're the second closest thing we have to a modern Indiana Jones video game, and people love it for good reason. They're reminiscent of a bygone era, faithfully keeping in tune with the series' origins, to a degree. They retain linear level structure instead of being open world like most other games in the genre, and linearity is something I personally miss dearly. I feel like linear games are just better at maintaining some level of consistent quality, since knowing the exact path players will take allows developers to pace the experience in a more controlled manner, and supply a steady trickle of unique content, instead of scattering and spreading content thinly over a larger, more open-ended map. The games are flashy and boast unparalleled spectacle, with their grand, larger-than-life set pieces and expensive-looking graphics. They're absolute eye-candy material and rarely crumble under the weight of their own ambition, being fine-tuned to an impressive degree considering how closely together they were all released, with only a few years in between each one. I adored the 2013 Tomb Raider. It was one of the most distinctly memorable games to come out that year. But for one reason or another, the novelty of these games started to wear thin on me after only the second installment in the reboot trilogy. And after going back to reconfirm that Shadow of the Tomb Raider was, in fact, monumentally better, I felt a need to go back and explain exactly what rubbed me the wrong way about this particular game. Back when Rise of the Tomb Raider was released, I didn't quite possess the cognitive faculties or the proper vocabulary to explain why I liked it less. However, several years ago, I did write an entire script about this series that never saw the light of day. If you're a $3 or above patron, you have access to the script through Google Drive already. Go read it. It's probably not very good. So I'm gonna try to pick out exactly what bothers me about this particular iteration of the series. Before I start, know that I did mostly enjoy playing through this game. It's strong 6 out of 10 material, and I would definitely recommend it to anybody who enjoys action-adventure sandboxes. But seeing as how you could watch many other reviews for a more positive take, the video I wrote is a bit more critical. I just want people to understand why myself and others might not enjoy it as much as most people did. So first off, the game still acts like we're in the process of unveiling Lara's origin story. And as many people have noticed, this is sort of undermined by the fact that this is Lara at her most capable. She can jump higher, shoot better, run faster, and perform all sorts of death-defying feats. To an extent she flat out couldn't manage in the originals. She's pretty much the strongest she's ever been in terms of raw physical strength and willpower. Her canon KD ratio is like 0 to 5,000, but her personality didn't get the memo. She just acts like a clueless college kid. She has book smarts and knows all these different languages, but her demeanor is kind of clueless and I don't know, she seems mentally absent. She isn't witty, she doesn't seem to really comprehend or even recognize the reasons behind her actions and goals. She just repeats her mantra, I have to do this, or alternatively, I can do this. She's portrayed as a victim of cruel circumstance despite the fact that she willingly came to Siberia knowing fully well it would be dangerous. The game wants to paint her as this doe-eyed messiah who saves the world out of, what, the goodness of her own heart? It seems like she's here to carry on her father's work, which is kind of a selfish reason to kill people, because she kills a lot of people she doesn't have to, for personal reasons, and that would be okay if this was a morally ambiguous character, like Nathan Drake. And Uncharted actually addresses Nate's murderous tendencies, sometimes. This game does no such thing, instead portraying her as a selfless hero with basically no notable character flaws. And I think it's this discrepancy in particular that makes me not just indifferent towards her, but genuinely disdainful. She seems to have no self-awareness and no concept of morals. When she killed someone for the first time in the 2013 game, I think she had at least one kind of what have I done type of moment for a second or two, but from that point on, she was like, fuck it, I guess I'm a mass murderer now. I'm not asking for cutscenes depicting her flashbacks and night terrors, I'm just asking for at least some notion of conscience, or for the game to acknowledge the fact that she's a monster. With the things she's been through, you would expect some semblance of angst or stoicism, but her past doesn't seem to weigh on her in the slightest. Her entire personality is just determined. She's the I can do it girl. You're supposed to root for her because no matter how many ledges crumble when she grabs onto them, no matter how many times she gets impaled by rebar, she just grits her teeth and presses on, panting heavily and clutching her side. When we do see her deep in contemplation, it's at the campfire she makes. But her inner monologue is a glorified plot device, dispensing information about her past or reiterating events taking place in the story, rather than re-examining her own actions and providing insight to her thought processes. Also, she has no sense of humor. The whole game is bereft of levity. Yeah, you can argue that this is young Lara. This was before she became showy and cool and charismatic and confident. There's no prior canonical precedent for what she used to be like, so this game's interpretation is as good as any. But why would you want to play as a boring, underdeveloped, uncharismatic version of this character? They could have gone any direction with this, and they ultimately chose to just not pick a direction at all. Nobody in real life is this boring. Lara isn't alone in this respect. The writing for each character is equally lacking in flavor and nuance. Her friends almost exclusively serve as fodder for her non-existent growth. That guy at the beginning was basically just around to serve as an extra point of contact with the ice wall, so we could have that part where he catches her and she swings across to the other side, and after that she just leaves him there to die. The main villain's reason for finding the MacGuffin is basically his entire personality. Most characters' motivations define their entire personality, actually. It's extremely hard to even describe who they are without just describing what they do. It usually boils down to brave, ambitious, and defiant. The dialogue is less actual dialogue and more a revolving door of cliches, one-liners, expository passages, and exhausted grunting on the part of Lara. Lara's incessant wheezing is almost omnipresent. She's out of breath in pretty much every cutscene. She needs to see a doctor. And she has all kinds of different grunting sound effects. Her exertion noises probably take up a quarter of the disk space. The plot is a mess of contrivances. It seems like literally anywhere Lara goes, she happens to run into evil people just as they happen to also be reaching the exact same spot for the exact same reasons. They've been set up here in Siberia for God knows how long, and they only start making actual headway once Lara shows up. And the bad guys are as stereotypically terrible as they can be, stopping just short of eating babies. No one individual likes to believe they're evil, but the villains in this series revel in their misdeeds to an unrealistic degree. Even the grunt soldier enemies will engage in idle chat about their favorite hobbies, like murdering people, especially when they're unarmed they didn't do anything. Hey, remember the time we shot up that preschool? Hell yeah, dude. That was almost as fun as the time we took turns kicking a pregnant woman in the stomach. Bitch shouldn't have tried to stop us from skinning that dog. Anyone who isn't Lara or her friends is a baby-eating Nazi, which makes the sanctimonious nature of Lara's plight all the more annoying and self-righteous. In addition to the preachy writing, the voice performances make it even harder to take this game seriously. Lara doesn't sound like she's a determined explorer fighting for her life. She just sounds winded and bored. It's like she just goes along with the other characters' conversations for fear of offending them. And it's not just her, just about every character sounds borderline lobotomized. The voices of minor characters who dispense speech blurbs when you walk past them, or the soldiers you fight, are shockingly amateurish sounding.
You there. We could use some help if that's what you're here for. There's not enough. We have to make do. There has to be more.
It feels like you're listening to someone acting for the first time, like they're not quite certain about any of the words that are coming out of their mouth. The soldiers are particularly egregious. They all talk in this comically overdone, grizzled inflection that sounds like an 8-year-old's idea of how a bad guy would sound.
Stand back! This is mine! I'll burn this whole place down! Make it safe back there! Oh shit!
These voices belong in an anime for infant babies who poop in their diapers, not an M-rated shooter game. The cutscenes are dismal, and I strongly urge you to play without them. And I assure you that you're missing out on negative things by just turning off the voices entirely. The running around and jumping all over the place is pretty fun, but it requires so little player input that it almost feels like it's playing itself. You really just have to point in the vague direction you want to go in and spam the face buttons until you end up there. There's so little space for human error, remember, I was just completely zoned out whenever I was climbing something. The reason I like the platforming in the originals better is that it's legitimately challenging, because learning to live with those tank controls and dodgy grabbing mechanics is part of the fun. Even climbing small obstacles can be a challenge because Lara behaves less like a human, more like a specialized vehicle that you have to learn how to maneuver. Every action has a small delay, so it requires a moment's notice to perform a running jump. Every acrobatic feat needs very precise timing, and you have to sort of step back and aim yourself before you try to mantle over a ledge. Jumping and grabbing are bound to different keys or buttons, so if you want to grab onto something, you need to confirm that action separately. This makes platforming a very intentional art that takes some getting used to. You have to put in a lot more work to get where you want, and when you finally scale that ruin, you feel like you just injected black tar heroin into your heart, because it probably took forever. There is no auto climbing. If you made it to the top of something, it's because you possess the skill required to scale it. In Rise of the Tomb Raider, you pull the analog stick upwards to climb, and press A to jump whenever you reach a break in the wall's texture, or come across a gap. It's just not involving enough for me. It feels more like an excuse to slow you down more than anything because no part of it is challenging. It doesn't feel like an accomplishment when the game basically does all the work for me. It reminds me less of the earlier Tomb Raider games than it does Assassin's Creed, where climbing is about as complicated as holding down a button and running towards obstacles. It also reminds me of Sonic Rush, where the platforming is a very guided experience and more in service of making you feel cool than actually challenging you. You'd have to not be paying attention or have some sort of legitimate motor disability to mess up the platforming in most cases. In the original, however, you have to position yourself in the right places, judge distances, plan your route. There's an actual risk of fucking up, because if you get lazy or impatient and jump too soon or try a shortcut, you'll plummet to the bottom again and have to start all over. It's kind of frustrating, but a game like this needs stakes. Usually falling in the new Tomb Raiders will kill you and you'll end up respawning not very far from where you died. And it's not hard to get back up to where you were, you just go through the motions again, which for me is nigh insufferable. Lara physically acts as if she weighs 15 pounds, has no real sense of momentum to her movement, and seems to be magnetized to whatever wall she's holding onto. She barely loses momentum from deadly looking falls. She's able to fling herself upwards 6 feet with nothing more than a strained poop grunt, and her ability to cross bottomless chasms with relative speed and ease makes her actually look like somebody with superhuman abilities. And it's not like you can just tweak some setting to switch from automatic to manual. Everyone has to play this way, and some people might prefer a system that requires precise inputs, since this is about half the gameplay. Despite all this, I did find the platforming mechanics to be fun in their own way. Just not my preferred way. My main criticism is that it isn't trying to be challenging, it's trying to appeal to a wide audience of casual gamers. But what it does accomplish is also fairly impressive. The flow of free running owes a lot to how hard the devs worked to make all of Lara's animations transition smoothly into one another, in accordance with all the inputs you're giving. Her body will realistically go through the motions and adapt to whatever new thing it's doing without looking awkward or jerky. I mean, she's pretty much beating world records every time she climbs something. Nobody jumps up walls like that, but the way it looks does not at all call attention to the unreality of her abilities. The game has a lot of fun ways for you to get around. You can get across gaps by swinging on a rope like basic bitch Tarzan. Not that swinging on ropes is anything new in games, but the way it's implemented works pretty well as an addition to the usual parkour moves. She also now has a grappling hook that enables her to jump to ledges just slightly out of reach. My problem with this is that a lot of these abilities are contextual, and much of the time you'll jump to something and throw out your grapple hook, only to plummet to death hilariously because the game didn't deem the ledge grappleable. There's also those on-rails running sections where whatever platform you're on starts to crumble from beneath you and shit starts exploding, and this is as unwelcome and unenjoyable as ever. You're watching a glorified cutscene, but are also obligated to hold down the thumbstick and occasionally jump, and half the time you're too far away from the ledge you're jumping towards to grab it, but the camera just cuts to Lara landing safely, which just immediately takes me out of the experience. And these types of scenarios happen constantly. The logic behind why things are falling falling apart isn't always sound or present. This is the game at its worst in my opinion. By far the biggest improvement over previous Tomb Raider games is the combat. Square Enix took a game that wasn't a shooter, and they maintained the original spirit of the gameplay while adding on this whole separate element of more involved fighting. Now combat takes up almost as much real estate as the usual exploring that defined the nature of the original games. The old ones had a sort of Wolfenstein 3D auto-aim function where you basically hit any object you were facing towards, and enemies at different elevations would be automatically locked onto. In this one, you enter a whole other aiming mode when you hold down the trigger. You have a full range of motion, and auto-aim is mostly a thing of the past. This time, you call the shots, and it is just stellar. The guns feel solid and robust. Aim acceleration seems to be thankfully absent, and there's a serviceable weapon upgrade mechanic that ties into scavenging. Each gun serves its own situational purpose, and the upgrades you can get are actually useful, since each gun is balanced with its own overarching weakness. The rifle kicks up and goes all over the place when you shoot it, and investing in upgrades to recoil compensation is paramount to using it effectively. The shotgun is good in tight situations, but the last thing you want to be doing in a tight situation is reloading a shotgun, since you have to manually load each shell into the chamber. So naturally, upgrading capacity and reload speed is more than worthwhile. The same thing goes with the recurve bow's draw speed and hold time. For it to be viable in fast-paced combat scenarios, you need to be able to whip it out and fire it as quickly as possible. Throwables are also a nice addition. They're so easy to make, and the resources for making them are so plentiful that I ended up using them all the time whenever I came across discarded cans or bottles. It's the only way, besides special arrows, to create attacks with a wide area of effect, so naturally this asset is near indispensable. Even when you're caught with your pants down and didn't have a chance to actually craft the explosive after you picked it up, you can still buy yourself a second or two by just lobbing whatever you're holding at the bad guy, since aiming the throwables is also very intuitive. I highly recommend playing it on the highest difficulty because, at least for me, the lesser difficulties did not cut it. The combat is supposed to feel frenetic and twitchy, and you're supposed to be using all these different gameplay mechanics to dispose of enemies, but the only way you're gonna end up using everything to your advantage is if you play it on the hardest mode there is. Again, it's aimed at a casual audience, so if someone like Conan O'Brien plays it and can't figure out how to even get to the settings menu, you want the difficulty to automatically accommodate him. But anyone who plays games regularly is gonna turn normal mode into Swiss cheese, and they're not gonna use any of the more advanced combat abilities because it's easy enough just to deal with enemies by shooting them in the face. The Survivor mode, however, has you prioritizing killing as many enemies as possible in as short amount of time as possible so they won't be around anymore to shoot at you. So you're gonna end up using the proximity explosives, the special arrows, switching between weapons depending on how the battle is going. It also necessitates exploration, since those incremental stat increases and extra abilities become much more important. The puzzles? I'm not a big fan of. Almost every single one of them amounts to figuring out how to operate some kind of pulley system. And when I mean almost every one, I mean almost every one. They're rarely immediately intuitive, and the process of figuring them out is just to activate every interactable object in the area by shooting ropes at them until you succeed with blind luck. By the time you've figured out the logic behind the puzzle, you're already finishing up with it. I wish just one game had the balls to let you fuck up and ruin the puzzle, like you yank a minecart off a ledge because you weren't paying attention and the cart just doesn't respawn. I would applaud a game with that kind of permanence to its world where you can just fuck up an optional objective and then that part of the game is unavailable to you from that point on. I think that raising the stakes in that way would be a unique way to force the player to think about what they're doing, instead of just brute forcing the puzzle because that's the fastest and easiest way. Just kidding, that would be horrible. I just think it would be funny because it would piss off completionists, but you know, the puzzles are still good to have around, just so you have something to do other than running and shooting. They do serve an integral role in making the game feel less repetitive, even though the puzzles themselves are by and large all the same concept, just with slight variations. But maybe next time we could make it a bit more than an obligation, or an excuse to break up the pace. Exploration is there, because apparently this Assassin's Creed-esque habit of littering your game world with tape recorders and useless knickknacks is obligatory at this point. You're never gonna run up a wall so imposing that you'll actually need to build your skills and improve your guns to proceed, but the option is there if you feel like taking a break from the story to do something completely menial and pointless. The wide-angle, pulled-out camera is well suited for a game gaining your bearings, such as when platforming or scoping out an enemy camp, but it's ill-fitted for collectible hunting since small objects will sometimes blend into their surroundings at this viewing distance. And a lot of the collectible objects and other interactables are purposely obscured, most likely because they want you to use Lara's special Tomb Raider eyes to locate everything for you. I had that feature toggled off at first, but having to walk around and try to spot these infinitesimally small boxes and treasures and such became tiring very quickly. The minor rewards you get for picking up any of these omnipresent tokens just is not enough motivation to try and find all of them. The upgrade system may be decent, but the game is so easy already, even on survivor mode, that I actually avoided getting certain upgrades just to keep things challenging. I like to feel as if the game is always one step ahead of me, and that doing all the side objectives and collecting doodads is contributing to my ability to progress efficiently. But it's like the game just expects you to pick up all this shit because it's there, because that's how video games are nowadays. But when you input effort, it's common sense for the game to output meaningful rewards. This is simply an issue of balance, but balance affects everything. I cannot have fun in a game that is disproportionately balanced in my favor, unless it's Fable 2. Soundtrack, boring, boilerplate, bog standard, orchestral nothingness that serves more to fill gaps in the sound design than anything else. Because when you do turn the music off, as I tried to do since it was annoying me, the game just sounds awful.
Fires. The valley must be alerted.
Incredible.
Sophia.
The ambiance is basically non-existent, and the world feels incredibly empty and awkward without any music. Especially the voices, which sound like they're speaking in a studio, not outside, and it's kind of jarring and makes the whole soundscape feel uncanny and artificial. With all things said, the power of spectacle here is nothing to dismiss. I feel that it's only fair to balance the critique out by expounding upon one of its most important merits. The environments are rich, detailed, and impressively varied considering how open-ended it is. Just because these are technically open-world games doesn't mean you have to see all the same shit all the time. It still retains the pros of a more linear structure, being a very focused game that is constantly feeding you new content. New areas are opening up everywhere you go, and the level of effort expended on each of them is not hampered by the ability to go anywhere. Its world design is actually, dare I say it, Dark Souls-esque, or even Zelda-esque. While I was capturing footage for this video, I ended up recording way more of the game than I thought I would. Just when I'd hit the stop button as I decided I'd milked every last bit of scenery, more scenery assaulted me out of nowhere, and I felt that it would take away from the video to exclude any one vista from the visual portion of this critique. I would argue that the spectacle game term, attributed to flashy action games like DMC and Bayonetta, is a lot more linguistically suitable as a description for games like Tomb Raider, Uncharted, and the Call of Duty single-player campaigns. A lot of the focus is directed towards all the insane, explosive shit that happens on screen. It can be very impressive to take in. They threw a lot of money at this game, and given the presumably brief development period, they were able to get a lot done. It's one of those games where the end product really does resemble and even surpass the concept art in some ways. They've perfected this pop action-adventure formula. It has everything AAA audiences want, all combined into one very versatile, very marketable game. It's an over-the-shoulder third-person shooter like Uncharted or Gears of War. It has a lot of goodies you can collect and tasks you can complete to make marginal improvements to your character, like in Assassin's Creed or Far Cry or any Ubisoft game. It tries to tell this gripping, suspenseful action movie narrative that calls back to popular Western films like Indiana Jones. It's taken every single aspect that sells and attempted to make this the ultimate and definitive everything game for everyone. And of course, people really like it because it satisfies all these different needs. It's really hard not to have at least some fun with this game. Even I enjoyed it, and I am a pedantic asshole. It throws so many darts at the wall, at least one of them is bound to stick. But because of this pop appeal, it lacks distinct identity because it just looks like any other modern action-adventure game. It lacks any focus, and instead of doing one thing really well, it just does everything okay, because that guarantees at least one aspect of it will appeal to anyone, except, like, people who don't own a game console or those psychos who only play Mountain Blade. There is just nothing unique about these games, and all three of them are virtually indistinguishable from one another, because the publisher is obviously scared that if they throw in something weird or new, people won't buy it. This is a shame, seeing as how what's there is impeccably well crafted. And seeing that this franchise is kind of important and kind of a big part of gaming history is why I find its paring down kind of offensive. Mass appeal. The game makes you feel like a badass. It's designed to flood your brain with endorphins. It's like potato chips and cigarettes. It feels good to tap the croft button and pick up all the glowing objects because there's this flashy box of information pops up on screen telling you that you did something good. The villains are unambiguously evil and excessively cruel, so Lara can spit in their face and the player can feel satisfied and morally superior, knowing that there has never been a more just cause than putting a stop to the bad guy's diabolical plans. Probably what offends me the most is how manipulative the cutscenes are, how morally black and white everything is, how Lara is painted as such a morally righteous and heroic character for killing people who are doing the exact same thing she's doing. It's obvious these games expect you to root for her, but I don't want to because she's an incredibly selfish sociopath. It's that cognitive dissonance that bothered me enough to make a full-on video about this. It's the way the game attempts to pat the audience on the back for simply playing the game and registering whatever stimuli are on screen. It's also painfully self-congratulatory. In summary, the Tomb Raider reboots have proven themselves fully capable of creating technically solid, enjoyable experiences, but the narrow-minded design philosophy, poor narrative, lackluster characterization, and an absence of player agency means you can only raid so many tombs before it starts getting old. For all we know, there could be another sequel on the horizon, so I think it's important to let whoever's making it know that we expect more next time. Regardless of whether you like it or not, surely you agree that there has not been enough innovation in between these games. The formula clearly works, but they cannot get away with just releasing the same thing over and over again. Something has to change. Hire some actual writers, rebalance the player progression, maybe make the next one a bit less bleak. Work in some of the kooky fun from the 90s games. Kookiness is in high demand. Whenever something vibrant and fun-looking comes out in the AAA industry, it attracts tons of positive attention, because people are bored of bleak, gray, overly realistic games about sad people. The market is stagnating. Lots of Hallmark franchises are just shuffling their feet, repeating the same mistakes and taking no risks. If a new Tomb Raider came out that paid respects to the original, took their best ideas and upgraded them for a modern audience, while adding new inventive features, critics and players would go crazy for it. Instead of saying, wow, a new Tomb Raider kinda looks like the last three, wouldn't you rather hear people saying, wow, new Tomb Raider is redefining the series in a way that is interesting and looks like fun to play? It's just my take on the matter.